This is how we play.
Discord fucked up for other reasons, as Discord is wont to do. Anyway, I suppose that we should probably consider this to be started.
Well, I am told that the very beginning is a very good place to start.
Well, normally I would agree with that sentiment, but the problem is people needing to know what the fuck a module is, because the definitions are squirrely, right? And I wasn't expecting that. I was like, probably everybody knows basically what a module is. But when you start looking for some of this stuff online, it becomes apparent that a lot of people have been just sort of assuming tilde adventure is just sort of a term for anything that characters can do, for any kind of story or pre-made anything that dungeon masters can run players through. And so some of these things have got like Cult of the Reptile God, which is like, 20 pages in the same list as Descent into Avernus, which is like 300. And it's like, well, we have to have a discussion about that, because apparently this word module is not as concrete as you would think. So I want to start sort of with talking about stuff like that, right? To just sort of give it a definition, which is that back in the TSR days, they would occasionally release these adventures that were modular in design. That's why they're called modules. The idea is that regardless of what it is that's going on in your world or your game or your campaign or even your setting, you should be able to set this one little thing, which is like for a level, for a party at a level, like a level 3 campaign or something. And you could just put that modular thing into any game anywhere. You could just fit it in there. It was like a shoehorn sort of adventure thing. And then these little modules would come out and people would buy them. And sometimes they could be like sort of episodic, or some would pick up where others left off and stuff like that. And then you'd have things like the Queen of the Drow, which is a super module. And a super module is a bunch of these things sort of in a line. So they don't necessarily have to be in a row when you play them. Queen of the Spiders, yeah. Because, of course they don't, right? And then that's featured in Yawning Portal, which is itself already one of these, right? Yawning Portal is basically a collection of modules, as is Ghosts of Saltmarsh, which is not to be confused.
And then there are ways that we can, of course, tie them together. They have sort of an overarching plot, which is how Tales of the Yawning Portal itself functions. You have that one tavern that the players keep going back to before preparing to go out on their new adventure. I kind of, whenever I run it, I like to run it as sort of like a restaurant at the end of the universe, because you're jumping to all sorts of places in space and time across the D&D universe anyway. So it also gives it a bit more of a mystical, magical, important feel to it than just, oh, hey, it's just some tavern.
Mm-hmm. No, it's fantastic. And it's brilliant, and it's a great way to do stuff like that. But the thing is, like, I could see why people are confusing that with other things, but like, Descent into Avernus, Storm King's Thunder, those are all supposed to be like an adventuring career, like from level 1 to like 15 or something. And even Curse of Strahd is, I think, 1 to 12?
I think it's like 1 to, I think 13 is roughly the maximum, although I've got some issues with the way they pace the levels. So like, you should ideally be like 10th level when you're going to enter Strahd's castle to face him. Mm-hmm. Though I find usually once you've completed most of the main stuff, you're more typically around like level 8.
Yeah, like Descent into Avernus is just like, fuck it, give him a level. And if you're doing Descent into Avernus the way they describe it, the way that they tell you to, these players are leveling like nobody's business. Fuck experience, just have another level.
I mean, like, in some cases, I do think that I like that milestone idea. I think there's a lot of dungeon masters who are really attached to the idea of having this experience. You gotta have X experience to level up. And, like, I understand that, and I know that some players really like being able to write down those numbers and see them get bigger and bigger and bigger. at the same time, I feel like it's so much easier to have control over the pacing of whatever your adventure is if you just tell your players, now you get to level up. Like, you just set a milestone, like, we overcame this big important boss at this point in the story. Now the players get to grow stronger and face more dangerous foes.
Yeah. The other issue, too, is if people level too quickly, then they don't learn what their character did by the time they get something new, and they don't know how to use it.
Yeah, that was... I've run campaigns where I gave the players too much power too quickly, and then suddenly the players were, like, out of control. I couldn't really give them anything that challenged them that didn't just outright destroy them.
I'll tell
and
you...
that's a very difficult balance as a dungeon master you have to learn.
You know what? I would take that any day, though, over having the players start to complain that they don't know how any of their stuff works.
Oh, yes. I've got a player who does that, and it is it is annoying to deal with.
Well, yeah, because, I mean, and if they're just tearing through the experience and you don't play very often, how are they supposed to? Like, how are they supposed to know what the hell they should be up to? And then you wind up with players being like, oh, I should probably have used this ability I forgot about. Or this one. And when you don't get to play consistently, but you're leveling up too quickly, you know, it's like I had one of the players that's doing the Fighter Barbarian, which is an outrageous combination, especially when they're Goliath, because they just do more damage and then heal themselves. But they have to remember to do it. And if you don't consistently play, right, and you forget that you have that kind of stuff, it could be a real issue. But anyhow, what we should be discussing now that we've sort of talked about this. So modules originally were like these little miniature adventures that you could just jam in anywhere you wanted to. And they sort of don't really do that for 5th edition officially anymore. Because they're focusing on these big releases like Descendant to Avernus, which I adore. What's the Rise of Tiamat? That one, like, there's a bunch of these, and they're huge and expansive. They're quite well written.
It's something like Rise of Tiamat into Tyranny of Dragons. Like, there's two different adventure paths that are basically take you from level 1 to level 20 as adventurers. And, like, yeah, that stuff is really cool, especially since now you can buy both of them in a single book.
Yeah,
which is on my D&D wish list for anyone who's wondering what to get me for my birthday this year. Yeah. You know, wink, wink, nudge, nudge.
But they also like mix in with Descendant to Avernus as well, because Tiamat is featured there, right? And you know, you can start to see a lot of stuff like that, and that's the sort of thing they're doing. It's like the Marvel films of. It's like the Disney Marvel films of tabletop role-playing. So what's been going on for modules in the meantime are people have been doing them themselves on the Dungeon Masters Guild, right? Which is a website that Wizards of the Coast maintains where people can share their own creations. And that's where, like I've got this one here, apparently, Defiance and Flan, which, at a guess, it looks like cost me $3. I don't know how I procured this, but apparently I have it. I've never read it, but it's interesting to me. And so, yeah, and people, you can just upload them yourself after you've written them, and then, you know, sort of hope that the cream rises to the top and meritocracy wins out, which I'm not going to hold my breath for. I don't imagine anybody else should either.
I mean, that's an entire separate discussion from all of this. But the point being,
that's where modules are now. Basically, the community mostly makes them at this point.
And that's not to say that the community isn't creating some of these other things that Wizards of the Coast is creating. Like, we're seeing adventure paths out there. We're seeing like the setting stuff, sort of like Eberron. Avernus could be used as setting stuff. Sword Coast Adventures, that's definitely something that's out there. And like, people are still publishing their own worlds, and that's all really cool stuff. Mm-hmm. But like, a lot of the little things, it's people just kind of group everything together under that. And to be fair, I'm kind of guilty of that myself. I'm working on stuff that's more like an adventure path or a campaign setting than a proper module. But I've also made modules in the past, just those really short little adventures. I like to write modules for holidays,
Oh yeah.
especially Christmas.
Well, and there's nothing wrong with that anyhow, because if you do little modules at a time and you put them out there and you're like, if you like it, give me $1, and you've done enough of them, and then you put them together into something and you're like, this is a campaign setting now, and then that's a perfectly reasonable way to do things. But I'll also note vice versa, from what you said about how there are people in the community doing these other things too. Well, one of the people that's putting some of this stuff up here on the DM's Guild is Monty Cook. Monty Cook, who wrote Dead Gods. Monty Cook, who wrote the Book of Isle Darkness for Wizards of the Coast. He was originally named for the position of leading the team on 5th edition. Like, he's the real deal. And this is how he's doing stuff too. And then he has Monty Cook Games, which does live streams and YouTube videos. And then he'll put out, by the way, we've got some new 5th edition material that we've done. Check it out. There's an episode of him pushing a new product he's selling over the DM's Guild. And he brings in Jeremy Crawford because he and Jeremy Crawford have been playing together for years. And Jeremy Crawford's like, yeah, I remember playing in that back in the old days. It was really fun.
I mean, it's pretty hard to compete with, something like that, where you've got an endorsement from Wizards of the Coast, from the lead designer.
Yeah.
But pretty hard for, the layman to compete, but it doesn't mean it's impossible.
Well, it's not necessarily competition either, because Monty Cook has his own company now, and produces their own original materials, but he's doing stuff for the DM's Guild, and even though he represents competition, Jeremy Crawford, who officially represents Dungeons & Dragons, is willing to come in here and be like, oh yeah, because that's sort of how a lot of this stuff works. But also, the reason I brought that up is because there are people doing this who are real professionals too. Just like the vice versa of, there are people that are just members of the community writing adventure paths and campaign settings on the DM's Guild.
One interesting thing I wanted to mention is that a lot of people, I've noticed, people don't really run a lot of modules anymore, and from what I've experienced, and not just, the modules, but also the super modules, the adventures, the adventure path. And the ones they do typically run are, the big official one by Wizards of the Coast. So, like, Tales and Strahd and stuff like that gets out there. But I find that a lot of DMs grew up with dungeon masters who, would create their own adventures and create their own settings and campaign settings for everything. And as a result, DMs, I've noticed a lot of them grow up just sort of being used to running their own worlds like that. They're not used to modules. And yeah. I didn't have modules when I got started as a dungeon master. Lord knows that I would have appreciated having a bit more structure to work off of. But instead, I just kind of had to throw myself into it. And for a lot of new DMs, that can be very intimidating. So if there's anyone out there who is interested in, running your own campaign setting, I highly recommend going out, picking up, some of these modules or adventure paths. Personally, I think Tales of the Yawning Portal is a great sort of beginners learning how to D&D, learning how to dungeon crawl, because you get to jump to so many different settings and experience a lot of different play styles within the game. Curse of Strahd, I think it's fantastic, although some folks might not like the horror vibe. There are tools out there, these modules and these adventure paths and stuff like that are great for new DMs who are coming into the scene, so that you don't have to go through the same pain that we went through when we were learning how to DM.
Well, and you just, if you get some of these modules, like find something that's really popular, and be like, okay, so maybe I could run something like this. It's a small, simple adventure. You're probably gonna have a better time, I think, than you would be even just trying to run one of the adventure paths, because the adventure paths are huge. And I suspect,
you can run for ages on some of those. I mean, to be fair, like, they tend to tie into a bigger overall adventure.
Yeah.
Like, there's a lot of cool stuff you can do with Waterdeep. Honestly, just running into Xanathar is really kind of cool, especially since he's the guy on one of the 5th edition books. Xanathar's guy did everything.
Yeah.
Like, tie that stuff into your campaign, definitely.
Okay, so at this point, we know what modules are and why we're talking about them and how they're different from other things, and how they sort of exist now in the current system, or in the current zeitgeist. So let's go back and introduce ourselves, talk about why we're doing this.
Well, my name is Daniel Clock. I am a DM of 8 or 9 years at this point now. I've played across about a dozen different systems. Started writing my own homebrew stuff, and I started, creating my own campaigns from scratch. Didn't have modules to work with. I'm working on some adventure paths now for D&D 5th edition, hoping to get something stable and cool for everybody to play.
My name is Aaron Lampe, and I started Lampe Creative back in 2015 to try to get culture creators, artists, musicians, writers, poets, that kind of thing, together into a community. And I'm still working on that now. But most of what I have ended up doing in order to reach out and get people involved revolves around the hobby of Dungeons and Dragons, which I've also done sociological research on at Boise State University. And a lot of this is part of ongoing overlaps between those various projects. I started playing Dungeons and Dragons in 1996. Since then, I've played pretty much anything I could get my hands on. I've tried variations on tabletop wargaming, all the way through to variations on Dungeons and Dragons, and a lot of related homebrew, and even stuff like Big Eyes Small Mouth and shit like that. So there's things I've played that nobody else will have tried because it's garbage nobody should have. But a lot of things too that I'm very familiar with, that are the go-tos for a lot of these things: Dungeons and Dragons, the White Wolf games, that sort of thing. And I've written my own version of Dungeons and Dragons over the past 4 or 5 years, which is called the Lamp Edition. We play that on my channel a lot. So I've also been thinking about getting some of the information that is in the Lamp Edition that's specific to my version of the game, that doesn't have any equivalents in 5th edition, into some kind of publication that I'll make available someday. But one of the examples of this kind of stuff that I'd like to talk about real quick is in D&D Beyond, which is another way that you can share your own creations with the community. Where I made the Circle of the Savage Druid, which has had 114 views, so that sounds like people are interested in what this is. But because of the requirements that they have for custom classes and the way that that's inputted, they still have, for example, Wild Shape, and part of the intention was for the Circle of Savage to perhaps not even have Wild Shape, so that there's a 5th edition version of the Druid, which operates something more like a nature cleric in a certain way, with certain fundamental differences. So that will go in a different publication as well. Just to give you an idea of how far-reaching some of these can get.
Now I've made some stuff like some other stuff myself. I have a Totem of the Courier Barbarian, which is based on a character I played in Lamp Edition. I've also done some work on, I believe it's like a Primal Path for the Monk, where you sort of incorporate some animalistic partial transformation into your martial arts, sort of like that wild-shaped druid aspect sneaking into monk a bit, as well as, the idea of those ancient kung fu techniques based on all the different animals you talk about. Literally, hidden dragon, crouching tiger. There's some cool stuff out there, even though there are restrictions, based on whatever system that you're going to put it into. I've seen a lot of homebrew out there myself. A lot of it is horribly balanced. They just create it for the flavor, for the fluff. Oh boy. Like, yeah, sure, my character just gets like a +3 critical hit range and restores half his health every time he slays an opponent. But it's okay, it's balanced out because he can only use scythes as a weapon.
Let's talk about what we're trying to do right now. What's the module you're currently working on?
The module I am currently in the process of working on is called Tomb of Beheading. And it takes place it's actually a bit inspired by Curse of Strahd. So at the beginning of Curse of Strahd, you sort of get brought into this area when, and there's fog surrounding the entirety of Barovia, and it's impossible to get out. It's sort of like extra-dimensional almost, and trying to enter it just gets you lost, and you pop up in a random place in Barovia. What I'm doing is more of a desert adventure. It's inspired by a lot of those Arabian Nights themes. I'm trying to be very, very careful with the cultural sensitivity there. I don't want to step into anything. There's a lot of sort of Egyptian-inspired stuff. So the whole thing basically takes place in this desert region, which hasn't had rain for like millennia, because this ancient king basically trapped a djinn. And the djinn, refused to follow commands and cursed the entire region to be without rain and surrounded the entire thing in basically this giant eternal sandstorm. So the players find this magic map and they travel through the regions across the desert to try and collect, different pieces of the map. And once they have it complete, it'll lead them to the location where the Tomb of the Dead King is. So they go through, they explore through the tomb, they save the djinn at the end, and restore water to the region, is the idea.
Although, you can never tell with players.
I mean, yeah, you can never tell with players. Like, the way I've sort of currently got it designed, it feels maybe a little bit railroady, because each piece of the map that you collect leads you to another piece of the map. But, I mean, players can go off and do whatever the heck they want. It's technically possible for them to take over the Oasis settlement in place of its current leader, and, just become the new rulers of the region if they so desire. But, I mean, that's D&D for you.
True enough. I was working on a module for my own game, which I would probably do a 5th edition version of eventually. Though I might twist and turn some stuff in various ways in order to make certain things a little more flexible. Because there are character choices in 5e that are going to be sort of weird. Amen. But as I was doing it, the whole thing revolves around a group of adventurers going out to sea to find a lost island with the potential to make people immortal, but it's all very secretive, very hush-hush. And nobody's supposed to know who's meant to be in charge of the whole thing. And there's a bunch of intrigue and twists and a plot there. And they would meet a character, this extraordinarily powerful character that has the secret to immortality. And all of this is very interesting and everything. But I realized as I was going through it that a lot of the stuff I was putting into the adventure made this way longer than just a module. This thing was huge. And it kept sort of swelling and getting bigger. And I could pull out the interesting ruins and things, and maybe that's its own module, but then the thing that I started with, the module might not be really that interesting as far as the combat goes, because I pulled out most of what made the combat interesting, unique, or special. When I would pull out the locations, the ziggurat. The ziggurat of death. And so, I haven't really gone back to that since. But I think about it a lot. I wonder if there would be an easier, better way to handle that. I did another module, which is really more just like a map and an idea, which in a lot of cases is all a module needs to be, about rescuing a version of the character Glubbly was just talking about from a pocket of the Shadowfell, which is sort of like a really dark, dreary tonally deep little adventure that's supposed to be around low levels for characters, for people that are just sort of starting out. But it's also not very inviting, so I'm not sure what I really want to do as far as a kind of simple introduction to my system for somebody else who might be running it. But I have somebody who's going to give that a try tomorrow. We'll see where that goes.
I do think one thing that worries me about that kind of campaign, particularly because I know the barbarian character involved, because that's my character, is that you've got what's basically, a 7th or 8th level barbarian there, and the players themselves are starting at, level 1 or 2. So in order to, have there be an actual threat that's capable of stopping this 8th level barbarian, things have to be, challenging or scary or in some way something the barbarian can't solve. So what if you have a party with, the exact same skill set, or like a party of barbarians that they're not going to be able to get through? Or what if you come up against a foe and the barbarian actually dies, and now you've got these 3 first level characters to get something that just killed an 8th level character? That's not really it's at the very least, you might want to consider toning down that 8th level barbarian so that he's not that far ahead of them, but he's still this powerful figure in the back that they can use in creative ways. That would be something I would base the dungeon around. Find ways for the party to take advantage of this extra unit that they've got, who's incredibly powerful, and what abilities he brings to the table, and use that to solve the puzzles in conjunction with their own abilities.
Yeah, and a 5th edition version would have to be very different from the way that I ran it, too.
Oh, yes.
Bounded
so much
accuracy
different.
would make having that level disparity outrageous.
I mean, an 8th level barbarian 5th edition is... oh my goodness. The numbers would be very, very different. It's how many times more hit points? Even if we assume average.
Let's talk about what goes into making a module.
The most important thing is to have an idea. What is the core goal of your module? Is there a really cool place that you had an idea of that you want to explore? Is there an interesting bad guy you want to have players, stack up against? What is it at the heart of what you're trying to create in your module?
And put that up front. That can be important too.
Yes, if a player goes in expecting a survival campaign, they build for that instead of building for, say, trying to strive to defeat this big boss fight. Curse of Strahd in the title, right there, you know that the goal is to defeat Strahd. Baron Strahd von Zarovich, or I think is his full name. And the entire adventure is all about beating Strahd.
Exactly. And you know that going into it. You know what the basic premise is, because if somebody has got to go through your adventure chronologically in order to figure out what it's about, you've screwed something up there. That's not gonna fly. You want it to be set up so that whatever it is that makes your module special or interesting, and how that is related to whatever the key element might be, like a location or usually the villain, let's be honest, then you want that to immediately be the first thing you're talking about. And then you want to have an example of that there, an explanation of how to use it, and then you can build the adventure chronologically after that has been explained to people. Like with Curse of Beheading, we might need to start with the fact that there's this weird sandstorm thing happening, and that what the players are going to experience going through that, and that'll give flavor to the situation. If you're going to do a Dark Sun thing about there not being water, for example, then that's something that needs to be covered immediately. Because if you don't, and then somebody just picks up this module and has a session 0 with 2 characters that are made at that time without anybody knowing any better that can just create water, although that might be something you want to do deliberately, but at least you should be able to see that coming.
Yeah, the create water cantrip is definitely something that I'm going to have to take into account, especially since the system I was originally creating it for didn't really have methods of doing that. I think the main thing is that what would most likely happen is that would immediately catch the interest of the guy who is in charge of the oases. I should probably get my notes for this campaign pulled up.
Yeah.
But just little things like that. That's actually something I wanted to bring up, is that you have to be very careful when you're creating your module to not either alienate or overpower a class.
Yeah.
Clerics are known to be especially guilty of this just because they're already a really powerful class, but they are specifically incredibly powerful against undead, like that entire class of monsters. So if you want to build your campaign like Curse of Strahd around a lot of undead units, ghosts, zombies, skeletons, stuff like that, you're going to find that you got to be really careful to make sure that there's more variety in the enemies than just those undead units, because otherwise a lot of the campaign is going to result in that one character having so much more power and agency than all the other characters in your campaign.
Yeah. But there can be a lot of things that'll throw off the feel or even the function of a campaign. And a module, you have to ask yourself if it's going to be worth it to do something like that, because remember, if this is something that somebody else is supposed to be able to just slip in to their long-running game or their various campaigns or plans, then you have to write it in such a way that it can be contained and still stay interesting. So what are you supposed to do about the fact that you have people who can create water that might do that? Healing is another one. You might want something to have a low magic feel to it, but if you're putting that into a module, somebody can just put that module into any game. That like Faerun is notorious for having outrageous levels of magic all over the place. And then the bizarre levels of pseudo technology that go on in Eberron. So how is somebody going to do Keep on the Borderlands? In either of those. What are you going to do if you want there to be low magic, or healing to be less effective, or a cantrip's going to be overpowered, so you have to limit it in some way? And my instinct with things like that is usually to be like, okay, so I'm going to put some kind of harsh limiter on this, but I'm also going to do something that makes it clear that it is way more useful here than it ordinarily would be. The NPCs need to react to that in a way that makes the character, or that makes the player feel like their character is special, important, and interesting. But at the same time, you're taking something away from it, right? Like if they could only create half as much water and they can only do it a few times per day instead of being able to do whatever they want as often as they want, right? Then you can sort of trade that for the value that it has in that campaign setting in a way that is going to be as immediately and directly feasible for them as possible, to make them see what the trade-off is, and that trade-off is going to be worth it under the circumstances. Somebody who has spells in a otherwise low magic scenario, you might put a hard limit on, like, maybe the damage or something, or they can't use rituals as many times as they like, or something like that, and then have it be at the same time the people in this like Conan style world where it's very low magic are like, holy shit, the magic you're capable of doing is something nobody else here can do. This is like the magic they used to tell stories about back in the old times. There are myths about people that can do this kind of stuff. And then that player is going to feel special and important, and you need to make it as clear as possible that you're going to make that worthwhile for them while you're taking away something that they're used to their character doing.
Revivify, yes, like the ability to essentially bring a character back from the dead, even if there are very strict limitations on how to do that.
At very low level.
Another spell that I think is very important to bring up, if you are running a survival style campaign, or like the players are out in the wilderness and one of the goals is to make sure, that they go adventuring to find as much food and stuff as possible. Good berry, which creates 10 berries in your hand. Eating berry not only restores a hit point, but it also provides enough nourishment to sustain you for one day. So as soon as you have a sprig of mistletoe, which is the only material component for that spell, you essentially have infinite food for for the cost of one first level or higher spell slot each day. So it completely removes, that frustration or that entire plot going on of having enough nourishment, having enough food. You don't have to hunt, you don't have to farm, you don't have to steal food from, like, I don't know, maybe there's a tribe of bandits out there or something that have food that they've hunted down that you could take from them. All of that stuff immediately goes away with just this one spell, which is one of the reasons I don't like good berries. So there are times where I think you might even want to alter just very specifically how the spell works. So, for example, with the good berry spell, that sprig of mistletoe, you could say that the mistletoe is then consumed by the spell. So then this mistletoe, this little sprig of mistletoe becomes a really important thing for the players to have access to it. It rewards them whenever they do manage to get a hold of one. But it also doesn't completely invalidate your campaign once you have them, as long as it is consumed by the spell when you cast it.
Mm-hmm.
Because then you can set up these situations where, like, you see this sprig of mistletoe, but it's in a dangerous location. Maybe it's in the area of, like, this ferocious beast. Or maybe it happens to grow near this bandit camp, and there's the danger of running into them. So you have ways of taking... you need to consider that you might have to alter the actual mechanics of the game itself. One other thing I think is important is that you should never ever require the players to bring in a character of a certain class or have certain features or spells, unless you are going to find a way to provide that tool for them in the campaign.
Yeah.
For example, Tales of the Yawning Portal, early on in the campaign, there's this door. And if you are able to read the language on the door, which is written in Draconic, it tells you, rebuke the dead. And that is it's to tell you if you cast your Channel Divinity Turn Undead here, if you're a cleric, the door will open for you. So, first of all, in order to overcome this door, in order to overcome this puzzle, you need someone who can speak Draconic, and you need someone who can turn undead. And if the players don't have Draconic as a language, or they don't have Channel Divinity, then there's nothing they can do in that scenario. However, what the game does provide is that there are two characters who can provide these tools for the players. If the players befriended the kobolds earlier, they can bring Meepo along with them, and he can translate those runes for them. And later on in the dungeon, they can free an acolyte, a gnomish acolyte called Urky Timbers, and he is capable of turning undead and therefore getting that door open. It's great to create these interesting challenges, and it's okay to require certain things as long as you provide a way to have those tools for the players.
It's also important to note when we're doing something that modifies what the players are used to their characters being able to do. Not only is this rewarding thing necessary, but you also have to tie it into what it is that's going on around in the world. And yeah, maybe it's some kind of contrivance, but you have to make it make sense, because remember, this is being inserted into something else. So the changes to the rules you're going to make for this module in some way also have to be modular. So they have to be within the realm of the game, explained in a way. You also have to be wary of things like locking progress behind a skill. You always want to make it possible for players to fail forward. There's a difference between telling them and letting them find out. But you want it to be as easy as possible for characters to realize that there might be resources around them, like somebody who can speak Draconic, or somebody who can cast the right kind of spell, or somebody who can pick the lock, or whatever it is. If you put them in a situation where they're like, okay, we can't read this, and we don't have anybody, or we can read it, and we don't have anybody who can turn undead, then that shouldn't become a dead end where they have to come up with an answer necessarily. You hopefully want them to know what sort of opportunities they might have, or what kind of possibilities might be on the table. You want to make sure that you have these things fleshed out in a way that is accessible to the players. If there's somebody in the campaign somewhere that's going to be able to turn undead, like maybe they're just like, well, maybe we'll come back to this later. But if the progress is locked behind it and they don't know where to go to find somebody who can cast that, because of the way that Tales of the Yawning Portal works, that might be a serious problem. Whereas, like, in Cults of the Reptile God, right, you start in this town of Orlais, and this town, like, it is a town. And if the players have been in that town and know things about that town, they'll know if there's an acolyte or a priest in that town already. And in Hanet, in the versions of Temple of Elemental Evil, you might be looking at something similar to that too, where the town of Hamet is a place where the players might know that they can go as a resource to find these things, to see, does somebody in the town have something like this? And if you're the dungeon master and you're playing this module that you're testing, and they ask a question like that, and you realize, oh, I don't actually know if there's a way that they can deal with this without it, then the answer to that question not only becomes yes, but you better write that down and add it to the module, because now, now you know that there's a way to deal with something that might otherwise stop the adventure in its tracks.
I also think that one thing that's really awesome is when you design something where there's not one right answer to everything. I mean, yes, the channel divinity door that I'm using as this example, it's a cool puzzle. It's not something that's used as part of the main progression. It's sort of an optional side area that the players can go into an adventure.
Which, of course, you can take more risks with.
Yeah, with those you can take more risks. But, like, if it's important to not have a single right answer to solving your puzzles. Like, if it's an optional area, then you can take more risks with that. Then you can be like, oh, if you happen to have access to these resources, and again, make sure those resources are available somewhere for the players, if they don't have them, within their exact party itself. But don't like say, like the channel divinity thing, that's the only way through. You don't have any other tools or options until you get higher level than the campaign itself will let you, and get access to stuff like Blink and Dimension Door, which would allow you to theoretically teleport in there. You allow your players to have some creative options for things that they can do. I'm not saying that you should make Dispel Magic become suddenly the fix everything tool, as some are want to do. It is a very powerful and useful spell, but like there are some things that certain stuff shouldn't work on. Yeah. But at the same time, you need to create multiple paths for your players to move forward. Let's say, for example, there is a group of bandits blocking the path in front of the bridge. So the players can choose to fight the bandits. They can try to negotiate them, maybe pay a toll to get across peacefully. They can try and sneak around the sides and swim across the river instead. Maybe they found a magical flight scroll that they could use to fly over the bandits' heads. Like, give your players options so that they're not tied down to one single solution, that, especially if it's not something that they can easily figure out.
Let's talk about moods and themes. One of my biggest inspirations, I think, I'm wearing on my sleeve at this point. I'm going to bring up Monty Cook again, right? Monty Cook knew how something was supposed to feel and had a tendency to bring a kind of gravity. You can see this in the campaign setting with the giant Tower of Doom in the middle of it. That was a hilarious idea, too. Like, it's so old school Dungeons & Dragons. Tolus. Tallest? My tallest? Yeah.
I think we get it. You like Monty Cook. And, like, to be completely fair, you have every right to like Monty Cook. He does good stuff. He's good at what he does.
But the thing is, like, with a lot of this, there's, like, Tolus is all based on the idea that it starts out with a bunch of adventurers looking at a massive tower on top of a massive mountain that's constantly being struck by lightning in a never-ending storm of doom and gloom. And it's like, well, guess where this campaign's going to end? Shot in the dark, probably. Right up there, with fighting whatever's in charge of whatever that is. And you know immediately, day one, the first moment, what's going on here. And that's communicated not because somebody at the beginning or in the introduction is like, by the way, this is a game about an evil in a fortress on a mountain, right? It's in your immediate perception. Your characters are immediately made aware of it, and it haunts your entire campaign until it's dealt with. And all of this is done with no necessary exposition at all, right? And so, like, what I'm doing with the module Thud in the Basement, which is the one about saving the barbarian from the Shadowfell, well, that's very much about feel. In fact, it's so much about feel that it has this, like, dark forebodingness to it. The descriptions are unsettling, and it's supposed to be something like a psychological challenge to the players to have their characters be there, as opposed to necessarily actually being that dangerous. Because there's like 4 possible fights. Well, I say possible. You can start fights with people you probably shouldn't fight, and that'll up that number to like 8 or 9. I mean, you could try and fight Thud immediately upon fighting him. I don't recommend that. You'll never take him down to that level, for one thing. It's just, you're not going to do enough damage. But the feel of being in the place is itself a challenge, right? And that can be hard to do if this is supposed to be modular, again. But you want it to have the right feel for the person that's going to use it, and you want them to know what that feel is going to be. So, like, if somebody's doing a long-term campaign, but the Dungeon Master wants to take a break and is going to play one of the NPCs, somebody else is going to take over, and they're going to run a module, but their party is like a necromancer, somebody's experimenting with the Far Realm Warlock, doing some Cthulhu stuff. You've already got a certain undertone of darkness there. You got an edgelord or two in that party for sure, right? So you might as well run something like that. You might as well run something like Thud in the Basement game. And if you do, it's going to fit into that. Or if you run the one with the pirates I was talking about, right? Sort of a spoiler that there's even pirates involved. But the one where they go on the voyage to sea, to the secret island, and all that stuff. Well, that adventure is also something that would fit easily in with a group like that, but Tomb of Beheading might not be. Whereas Tomb of Beheading sounds like it might be the sort of thing that's a lot easier to have people that are playing, maybe not necessarily murder hobos, but people who are more openly sellswords, people who are more openly the kind of rat catcher type adventurers that Matt Colville talks about, right? The sort of adventurers that really are just out to try to make a living in this crazy lifestyle of there's dire rats in the basement. We'll make a quick buck taking care of that. Whereas trying to take a group that's got like the normal motley crew of player characters and try and force them through something with that kind of depth, that kind of darkness, and that kind of, psychological imposition probably isn't appropriate. There are going to be modules like, looking at some of these old school ones, the ones that take place in the Underdark period, basically. But actually, I'll do Expedition to Barrier Peaks. Expedition to Barrier Peaks is notorious for pissing gamers the fuck off because it's science fiction. And Gary Gygax didn't respect the notion of separating fantasy and science fiction. Why shouldn't knights be able to find laser guns and fight aliens? And I am a huge proponent of that, although I'm probably a little more sensitive about how people are gonna get involved with it. Likewise, it's always been a hard sell in certain circumstances just to have the alchemist and the gunslingers. The alchemist characters and the gunslinger characters of Pathfinder and 5th edition, because a lot of people don't like that kind of thing being in their typical game. Now, that's something you have to take into consideration if you're going to write a module, or even if you're going to use a module. If you're playing with a group of people that take spellcasting very lightly, and a lot of the adventures they've been going on are low magic, like the Conan stuff I described earlier, even if they're not thinking about it, if you suddenly throw one of these that are written for Faerun in here, that have got, magic going on constantly all over the place. I'm trying to find something that might be an example, but none of the ones I'm looking at like scream, "Holy shit!" There's a lot of magic in here. Considering what the but it is something that has to be considered. Are you suddenly going to throw them into a world that doesn't make sense? So that's not even just true of writing them. That's true of what adventures you want to run, right? And where you're getting them from.
So I want to go back to a point that you made, like, way earlier on. You mentioned that, like, setting the mood shouldn't be done through exposition. That doesn't mean that you can't, like, set the idea of your campaign up through exposition. For example, Curse of Strahd, the whole thing starts off with the idea that you are a group of adventurers in a tavern and a shady figure approaches you. And that's like tale as old as time.
Yeah.
One of the oldest ways to start up a campaign ever is just a group of friends in a tavern, you get a letter from a shady figure, go to explore something. And, you know, then you have that letter, and then you just sort of figure out more about Strahd throughout the story. Although, to be fair, like, his name and face are slapped on the front of the book.
Yeah.
So it's pretty obvious as to what you'll be doing and who you'll be facing off against. But, like, exposition, absolutely a tool you can use. I also want to hammer down that, like, the way that you and the characters that you interact with, the way that those that world interacts with you, needs to have one big cohesive theme.
Yeah.
So, like,
and you have to get it across fast because you don't have a lot of time in a module.
Yeah. So I'm going to use Strahd again because I just think it's really well written. I think it's the best 5th edition adventure path module book, supplementary book out there. So if any of you are interested in 5th edition, I highly recommend Curse of Strahd unless you're really not into that horror aesthetic. Immediately, like, the second you step foot into Barovia, we're talking, not only is there this oppressive fog that, you know, blocks out most of the sunlight, which is, of course, ideal for a vampire lord ruling the region. But on top of that, we're talking the city of Barovia. It's a bunch of people who don't come out of their homes. They're addicted to these dream pies that are being sold by a hag. Like, everything is dreary and sad. And even when you finally go to Valakai, which is this other village where everything seems happy and seems normal, there's that undertone of, like, something's not quite right here. Something doesn't quite fit in. These people are maybe a little too desperate to be happy and stuff like that.
Yeah. See, and those are all perfect examples because it's not even necessarily show don't tell, because there are going to be times you've got to tell. How much time do you have to write something like this? It needs to be short, right? So sometimes you've got to just get it across as quickly as you can. But the dungeon master who's going to be running it needs to know that, and they need to know it up front. And the players need to know it as quickly as is possible, or even if you're going to be building tension over time, how much time do you have, right? And foreshadowing it, I mean, how much foreshadowing can you do in less than 30 pages? But
I am going to say, quick note for any of you who are running modules, you want to inform the players exactly what sort of adventure they're getting into right off the bat. Don't just throw them in blind. In some modules, this could be especially important. So there's this Pathfinder adventure path that I absolutely love because pirates are involved. It's called Skulls and Shackles. Ran it with a group of friends. So the game begins with you being shanghaied onto the ship. You are already on the ship with the pirates being forced into servitude. If you don't set that up for your players, the expectation that they're going to go out and they're going to be pirates, what you end up is this ridiculous mishmash of pirate-related tropes, but you're not actually being pirates. And the crew that I ran with was unfortunately notoriously guilty of that. We were not good pirates.
Mm-hmm.
We weren't even good privateers or even good sailors, if I think about it. But we were very effective as a group of weird and wacky adventures. It was sort of like Monty Python, except on the high seas.
Mind you, most of the characters were appropriate for the ocean, at least.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, we had a fish woman.
Yeah,
we
there was
had
a frog person.
There was a sea shanty singing bard. That's who I played. And like, don't get me wrong, it was a perfectly appropriate crew. It's just the mood that the players brought forth was very different from the mood that the campaign was trying to bring forth.
Yeah, and vice versa. In Pathfinder, we were doing Rise of the Rune Lords. That campaign did not last long. And my character was a multi-classed fighter gunslinger who was one of the sea elves. And I was sort of inspired by Skulls and Shackles and used some of it as a supplement for the stuff that my character was doing. And even though the whole thing started out in a port town, I wound up being weirdly out of place. And I thought that my character was great, but for the circumstances, I didn't really work very well. And another person, like Rise of the Rune Lords revolves around a lot of religious stuff. And the character I just described, I was playing. And then there were two gnomes, a druid and a gnome barbarian. This group had no business being in Rise of the Rune Lords at all. There's an NPC there to make sure that you have somebody who can track, who's a ranger. And we were like, dude, we've got like 3 trackers. Trackers is all we do have. Why couldn't you be a priest? It was awesome. It was.
I will say that there's not really any accounting for terribly balanced parties. I'm actually running a group of family members and a couple of their friends through Tales of the Yawning Portal, and their party consists of a paladin, a ranger, a wizard, and 3 rogues.
This is something that I think we should talk about now too, because this also goes into people not really understanding the difference between an adventure, a module, the super module, the adventure path. This is important because you should pretty much be able to play a module just about anybody. Like what we were saying, it's our responsibility as people writing a module to make sure that the module can fit into a world and be played just fine. If you have people that you're going to get to play Descent into Avernus who don't understand they're literally going to hell, there's going to be some very unpleasant surprises for those people in the near future, right? And we were going to do Rise of the Rune Lords, and it didn't dawn on anybody that because we think, oh yeah, it's Dungeons & Dragons, you just make characters and you play, that we were going to need to sit down, have a really carefully thought out session 0, and the Dungeon Master was going to have to explain to us what it is we needed to do without giving us any massive spoilers so that we had characters that were right for the game. My mod here, who's talking about cursed trophies, etc., right? Their character...
That is a reference to our Skulls and Shackles campaign.
Yes.
Andrial was the fishman. I think she was a fighter, actually. Played a lot like a barbarian, but I think
she was a chef. That's the important bit.
No, it wasn't. Well, I wouldn't call what she did cooking, but yes, she helped the chef.
So the thing is, but like comparatively, compared to that story, doing Descent into Avernus, her character is a lawyer who works for devils. That is perfect in Descent into Avernus. It is. You could not get something better for that, right? But something as specific as a lawyer who works for devils is not. It's not something for modular play. It's not something for. I mean, you could play them in a fun dungeon. Why not? But they're not. They're not for that kind of approach, right? But anything should be able to work in a modular game. Whereas, if you look at my out-of-place pirate, or their out-of-place not pirates, and the adventure paths, you can see a stark difference in the approach there to how those are written and played. If you have a bunch of characters who are going to do Storm King's Thunder, and they go into that not realizing they're going to spend most of their time fighting giants, characters of much higher size category than them with a lot of hit points, they're gonna have problems. They're probably gonna be very unsatisfied. But if you look instead at something like Against the Giants, which is a series of modules, right? I think Against the Giants is the first one, and there's like 3 others that they're in here somewhere. Well, you can cut that up, put that into various other adventures, and have all kinds of things going. You could just keep on the borderlands between them or something. You should probably have something that you want to make sure is level appropriate or modified. But that's the sort of thing I'm talking about here. Those, in that circumstance, it can be a lot more plausible, even though you're going to be fighting giants over and over again, for characters that aren't specifically designed for it to be able to go through that process. And if you write your own, and you slip your own in there somewhere, it should be able to run smoothly because it's got everything it needs, even if you have characters that really were min-maxed for fighting giants. Because anything they're not going to have, the macho's going to be able to provide.
And as long as we're bouncing around the subject, I do want to go back to Vernus moment as an, because there is a time when it's appropriate to sort of break that mood, give the players a bit of a breather, to give them, so let's say you've got this super serious campaign, you're going into the depths of hell, that's kind of terrifying. But then you also have these moments that kind of break that stigma up. So, what is its name? The Holy Fence? Something like that? It's this magical, furry, six-legged elephant creature that spews sparkles out of its trunk that make people feel happy. And as far as I'm concerned, that's a huge departure from the rest of it, where it's hell and everything is terrible. And of course, you've also got things like the infernal machines running around, and you could have this high-speed chase through the pits of hell, and that's a very different feel from the rest of it. We're sort of fighting life through all these devils. So I think if you use it intelligently, can in fact take things that break the mood. Or you could also use it almost to make something feel more like, say, this is strange, this is out of place, why is this here? Draw importance to that fact. Like I mentioned earlier, the mayor of Valakai is really insistent that everything is fine and everything is happy. We are going to celebrate frequently about all of these good and happy things that are going.
Yeah.
And yet, there's stuff going on in the background, which I won't spoil because you guys should play the module yourselves. It's really good.
Yeah. So, well, I mean, there was I think the original Strahd was a module, and then the Curse of Strahd Adventures have been getting bigger and bigger, I think, over and over again. But it is important to talk about that too, because again, in a module, you're generally not going to have time. But like with death metal, if what you're doing is reasonably long, if what you're writing is long enough, then it's meaningless if it's just balls to the wall all the time. You need to break that up with something. You have to have something that gives it variety and that gives it contrast in order for the moments that are horrible to have meaning in the horrible stuff, right? Like, comment, subscribe, and share.